Oh, it works. Careful, Marshall. Careful. Hey there, Marshall here. Welcome. Today, we're going to discuss many of the aspects of knife design to help you figure out what's going to work for you and your specific needs. What's best and what isn't. So, stick around and find out. All right, get comfy and settle in. We're going to jump right into what works and what doesn't. Everyone is different, which means not every knife is always going to be right for every person. So let's get started breaking down the basics so that you are aware of your options. First off, we all know there's many different ways to use a knife. So first thing in knowing what type of knife design is going to work best for you is to identify what you'll primarily be using the knife for. Many ways knives are used that should be considered are, for example, draw cuts. And a draw cut is a cut against a surface with the point, such as opening a box, where you just puncture the tip in and slide right down, making a very precise cut. So there are a couple of designs that lend themselves well to draw cuts, and one of them is the sheep's foot, which is typically a broad blade with an abrupt clip at the end that causes the blade to drop down. This allows you to choke up on the handle and run your finger along the spine and have a lot of control over where the tip goes. Another design that works well for draw cuts is the Wharncliffe. And the Wharncliffe knife is very similar. They're often a smaller blade and more fluently curved along the spine at the point, and they have a very straight edge. These again allow you to choke up on the knife and bring your finger to the tip very close without risking hurting your finger or poking yourself. Next, we have slicing cuts. And slicing cuts are a cut where you use the entire length of the cutting edge. So typically with a slicing cut, you can do a slicing cut with a push or pulling back to yourself. If you're pulling, you'll start at the heel of the knife and draw back along the edge to the point and beyond. If you're pushing, you'll start out near the point and push forward through. What makes it a slicing cut is that you're using the entire length of the cutting edge to make the cut, very similar to a saw. Another blade style that's good for slicing cuts is the drop point, and then previously the trailing point. And a trailing point is always determined by the fact that the point of the knife is above the spine. Now we have everyday cutting tasks, and we all know what those are. That's things like cutting string, opening mail, opening boxes, cutting rope, cleaning under your fingernails and toes, though we don't recommend that because that could get bloody real quick. Then we have hard use, and hard use is more typically for outdoor sporting knives and tactical and combat knives. They tend to be thicker, heavier, bulkier knives made for abuse. And these knives have a different type of edge geometry, but more on that later. Then we move on to food prep. And no, I'm not talking kitchen knives. I'm talking about that guy that we all know, maybe you're him, that is at a restaurant or a campsite and doesn't like the knives that you've been given to eat with or to prepare your food with. So you bust out your pocket knife. And when you do that, you want to think about some things with that knife. First off, one, what's the blade finish and what are you cutting? A lot of foods can stain and cause corrosion on blades. Depending on the blade finish, the shinier your blade is, the less likely to have corrosion, or you might want a coated blade. The other aspect to think about is that If your pivot is more open and exposed, you can get food particles or juices into the action of the knife, and this can cause a whole host of problems. Then we have collectability, and this one's pretty straightforward. You can collect knives based off of the type of blade pattern, the materials it's made out of, who made it, what company or custom maker. There's a lot of different aspects to collecting knives. And a lot of men are collectors and don't even know it because, well, how many guys don't have that drawer in the dresser that has 4 or 5 pocket knives in it that they pull out to use for different occasions? Now, I'd like to talk to you about ergonomics. One of the most important features of a knife is that it's comfortable in your hand when you're using it. So, we're going to talk about handle shape. One of the first things that you want to consider is the retention of the knife in your hand. So you're going to want to first off make sure that you have nice rounded edges to the knife. The handle can be curved or flat. It doesn't matter. You just want these edges soft in your grip so that they don't create what we call hot spots, which are areas of pressure in your hand that can cause pain or discomfort while using the knife. Another thing to think about is, depending if it's a fixed plate or a folder, whether you want a flipper tab or a guard, or if you want a thumb ramp on the back here to prevent your hand from sliding forward. We've all had that moment where we're using a knife in a way we shouldn't be, and we worry about sliding forward over the blade. You'll also want to have a bias towards the back of the handle to prevent your hand from sliding off the back of the knife. All of these create good retention and a knife that fits your hand well. So these are things to think about in there. Next, we're going to talk about your blade orientation. So on this knife here, you can see the blade protrudes straight out from the handle. This is the case on most knives, but not all. Some will have an advancing orientation where the blade is slanted down. This idea works very much like the follow-through of a swing of a baseball bat. The blade hits what you're cutting before your hand gets to it, allowing you to push deeper through the cut. Other blades will sweep back up towards you, coming up high off the handle. That blade orientation is intended for cutting against surfaces. It requires you to tip the knife like so, and it allows your knuckles to clear the surface you're cutting on. Lastly, in the aspect of ergonomics is gripping materials. There's a lot of different materials that can be used in the handle. Metal, wood, polymers, composites. All of these, we're going to have a different feel, and your hand is going to stick to them or slide on them differently. So with metal, I would recommend that you have some sort of texture. With composites, often they have their own texture applied to them, or they have a finish that is going to be slightly tacky feeling without being wet or actually sticky. Wood often is a very grippy option. Next, we have performance. This is one of the 2 most important aspects of what makes a good design. After all, a knife is a tool first. So the first aspect of performance is blade patterns. And believe it or not, there's a pattern for just about everything you can use a knife for. We're not going to go real deep into these. We touched on them with draw cuts, with the worn clip and sheep's foot and the trailing point and drop point. But it would be good to do a little bit of research to figure out if the tasks that you're going to be using the knife for have a blade pattern that lends certain traits and properties to it. Then, what about blade steel? Well, all steels are not equal. So I could make a whole video series about steels, but for this video, I'll break it down to 3 general types of steel. The first being carbon steel, probably the oldest of all the steels that we use today. They are very durable. They hold a great edge, but they have an Achilles heel. They rust. And so a lot of people don't want to factor in maintenance of the blade by oiling it all the time to make sure that the blade doesn't rust or stain. Then we have stainless steel. And stainless steels are wonderful. They're easy to care for. They hold a good edge. They're not the junk that a lot of people think they are. And the only flaw they have is while they're tough, they don't really bend. So they'll want to break before they'll bend. So you could end up punishing the knife and suddenly your blade just snaps. Lastly, we have probably the best option, which is powdered metal technology. And powdered steels are very precisely made steels where the manufacturer can custom tailor the alloy by adjusting the amounts of each ingredient to fit exactly what they want the knife to do. But the process of making these steels is expensive and state-of-the-art. So knives that use this steel tend to be at the higher end of the price range. Now, I want to talk about edge geometry. This is a ratio between grind height and blade thicknesses. As you can see here, where we have a taller grind on a thinner blade, this makes for a very slicey edge. Or here, where we have a shorter grind on a thicker blade. And this is going to give you a lot of toughness. I mentioned before that hard use knives have a different edge geometry. So the tougher edge geometry is not always the best for cutting, but it's going to give you that durability. It's going to make sure that while you might have to work a little harder to cut, the tool isn't going to fail you. But that's not all edge geometry is, because there's also the factor of different types of grinds. And this is something that you can dive in to the Google and learn for yourself. It's not a real hard complex, but it's a lot for a video like this. Lastly, on the subject of performance, we have locking mechanisms. There are many types of locks on the market, and some of them are very niche. So for this video, I'll tell you about the 3 most common lock types. The first off is the liner lock. And the liner lock is probably the oldest of these lock types, though interestingly enough, it wasn't patented until the 1970s. But you can see here on this knife, we have thin handle frames. These are called liners. And one of the liners moves over in front of the blade to block it. So this works very much like a doorstop. You're going to push the lock out of the way, and then you can start to close the knife. And when your thumb is clear, you bring it all the way to close. Liner locks have a very smooth action, and so they can be opened very quickly with one hand and closed quickly with one hand, allowing your other hand free to do whatever work you're doing when you need the knife. The next style of lock is another old lock, and one that more people are probably more familiar with, and that is the lockback. And lockbacks, the lock bar is typically found in the middle of the handle or the end of the handle. If you look here closely, you can see it's just a narrow spring-loaded bar running through the back spine of the handle that you simply depress, and that disengages the lock, and you can cycle it closed. And then to open is the reverse, and you'll hear that lock snap in place. These are very strong locks and very popular locks. However, they require two-hand use of the knife. So not every application is going to be best suited for a lockback. Lastly, we have frame locks. And as you can see here, we have a cut in the side of the handle frame that comes back under the pocket clip here. And this is very similar to the liner lock. However, you can see the handle frames are thicker and there's no grips that lay over the top of it. The reason is when you grip the knife, your grip literally reinforces the lock. But other than that, it works the same. You do have to make a cutout back here in the handle to thin the lock material so that you can bend it. But other than that, they operate very much the same as a liner lock. You can open it one-handed, and again, you push the lock out of the way, start the blade closed, clear your thumb, and return the knife to the closed position. And you open and close the knife, completely cycling it one-handed. And that's the frame lock. These will get you the best performance without getting into weird locks that are going to sometimes be a little bit confusing, or you might look at and not trust. Now we have aesthetics. They are more important than some might think, because really, who wants an ugly knife in their pocket? And I know that beauty's in the eye of the beholder, so what might be appealing for one of you might not be appealing for another. And this is why aesthetics are a thing in the knife industry. So the first thing you want to think about with aesthetics is the overall design theme. Do you want old-fashioned and traditional, or a classic knife design such as a multi-blade pocket knife where you can have more than one blade choice? Or do you want something tactical where it has that rugged look that looks indestructible? A lot of people like the tactical, but that's not actually what makes it tactical. What makes it tactical is the ability to take it apart, clean it, put it back together, and continue using it. Now we have artistic knives, and they're generally pretty fancy. They're typically handmade, but not always, and sometimes they're very old-fashioned, like a classic dagger, or they're really high-tech and futuristic looking, such as this knife here. This knife has very fluent lines. It's a very artistic knife, and you can't even see the hardware on it because so much attention was put to the aesthetics. And then you can have a different way that you would go, like this one here, where we have traditional giraffe bone, titanium bolsters, folded Damascus steel blade, even file worked spine and liners. So the fancy might be your thing. These knives, they can get pretty pricey. Now we have the tank. And the tank is your overbuilt knife. These knives have very thick blades, very thick handles. Often they are built out of incredibly tough and durable materials. These are the knives that are built for hard use. So sometimes, but not always, they have the edge geometry geared more for toughness. But they're a tool, and so we all know we're going to beat on our tools. Lastly, if you're just looking for a basic tool and you really don't care what the knife looks like, you might go to the hardware store and get a box opener, because nowadays in the market, all the manufacturers and custom knife makers are putting a lot of effort and energy to finding unique, desirable aesthetics for knives. Moving on, we have added functions. These are extra features on a knife design that give it the ability to have broader range of use or appeal. Some of these secondary features are bottle openers, screwdrivers, a saw blade, the toolbox, a kitchen sink. You kind of know where I'm going with that. Then there's a lot more gimmicky features. Now, by gimmicky, I don't mean like stupid or, oh, it's just pandering. These are features that don't really affect the performance, but they affect the user's experience. And those are going to be things like unusual pocket clips, unusual back spacers, movable pocket clips, articulating parts in the handle like some knife makers are doing, or security screws that require specialty drivers to disassemble the knife. All of these are things to consider whether they should be or shouldn't be in the knife that you're buying. Now, last but not least, we have finish treatments. Finish treatments can affect both the performance and the overall appeal of the knife. So with finish treatments, we have many different kinds. So the first one we're going to talk about can be done to the handle, and it's anodizing. And that is a color treatment that is electrochemically applied to the titanium. This is only on the surface, and it can wear over time and often does. Next, we have bead blasting. This can be done to the blade or the handle. And bead blasting is this matted gray finish. And you can see if you use different materials in your bead blasting, you can even get slightly different shades of gray. This process gives you millions upon millions of little dimples in the surface of the metal. And on steel, this can be problematic. While it looks good and while it hinders scratches of the blades being visible to an extent, it also encourages the steel to hold moisture, which can cause the knife to rust, even stainless steels, because they're stainless, not no stain. Next, we have coatings, and coatings are another good way to go. Coatings are applied to the outside of the blade, and they can come in any color. This one here is kind of a black or kind of smoke dark gray coating. They protect against corrosion 99% of the time. They give a cosmetic appeal, and some of the coatings are incredibly tough. But most coatings you're going to find in factory grade pocket knives are going to eventually scratch and wear away. So this is something you're going to want to think about if it's right in the knife for you, because eventually you're going to have exposed steel and coating in areas that you don't have control over. Then we have polished blades, and there's two kinds of polish. There's the satin polish, which is a softer look, and the mirror polish, where we all get that moment of vanity and want to flip our hair. So polishes, they're going to show scratches pretty apparently, but they're going to be less likely to corrode even if it's a carbon steel. There's just nowhere for the water to stick to the blade if it's polished correctly. But we have then the acid washed or forced patina blade. So you can see this blade is a darker gray and kind of muddled looking in its finish. This blade has been soaked in acid, and the acid is very aggressive against steel and wants to turn the steel black. Well, that dark color that's almost black is the most advanced stage of rust. So once you get to that point, there's nowhere else the rust can go. You've kind of sealed up the blade. So acid washes and forced patinas, which are one and the same, just a different name for them, these are a good option to have on your blade. They also call it a dark wash or an acid stone wash, and these will help prevent the blade from rusting. If you live in a humid environment, some blades will just rust in your pocket. Now that we've covered the basics of what to look for in a knife design that will work for you, you should have the tools to choose the best suited knife for you and your needs. Of course, this can and should change and evolve in time as your knowledge on knife design grows, which allows you to fine-tune your tastes and walk away from your purchase with confidence, knowing you've definitely chosen the right knife. If there was anything we talked about in this video that you would like to see us go further in depth on in a future video, please let us know in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to stab the like button and subscribe if you're willing so you don't miss any upcoming content. You know, the important stuff. Until next time, take care and stay sharp.
Join the Legion.